Unit Test Narrative Techniques and Structure. Read the passage. A community park. It was Friday, and as she walked home from school, Samara thought about what she would do that weekend. Everyone would be at the fundraiser for new sports equipment at the high school on Saturday. As she was trying to remember if any good movies were coming out this weekend, she noticed a group of kids playing tag. Samara thought they looked comical running around in circles on a small plot of land between two houses. Well, they certainly seem happy, thought Samara, as the light turned and she crossed the street. On the opposite side of Cherry Street, Samara saw Mr. Peters sitting on a bench. He was reading his newspaper as the heavy traffic of the town's main thoroughfare whizzed by him. She wondered how he could concentrate. Later, as she took the last turn onto her street, Samara saw her neighbor planting her annual vegetable garden. Every year, Mrs. Yang grew eggplant, cucumbers, and bok choy because that's all she had room for. "The garden looks good so far, Mrs. Yang," Samara called. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Yang said. "You know, if I had room, I would plant enough vegetables to feed the entire neighborhood. My mother had a garden that was 1 square acre when I was a little girl in Korea." As Samara nodded and waved goodbye, she started thinking about what she had seen on her walk home that day. She realized that Pine Grove did not have any open public spaces where everyone could go to relax and enjoy nature. The only unused space was a vacated plot on Cedar Avenue that was completely overgrown. Suddenly, Samara had a great idea. She decided to spend her summer campaigning for a new community park. The only problem was that she had no idea where to start. That evening, she went to the library and learned about what she would need to do in order to get the idea in front of the town zoning board. It was all a little intimidating, but Wanda, the reference librarian, helped Samara break it down into manageable steps. When Samara mentioned the Cedar Avenue plot, Wanda's eyes lit up. "That is a perfect spot," Wanda said. "It's right in the middle of town, and better yet, the town owns it." Samara spent many afternoons over the next few weeks at the library with Wanda and a few other librarians drawing up a detailed plan to present to town officials. Samara and the librarians even planned and priced out irrigation necessary for the area that was designated as a garden. When the day of the zoning board meetings arrived, Samara felt nervous, but Wanda and the other librarians were there for moral support. Samara thought that she at least sounded confident as she presented her idea to the board. When she finished her presentation, she was ready to wait patiently for an answer. Wanda told her that this kind of decision might take weeks, so Samara was surprised when the board members asked her to stay while they deliberated. The president of the board explained that Samara's presentation had been the last order of business for the day, and he wanted his board to be able to agree on one thing before they left. After about 15 minutes, Samara was informed that the community park had been approved. Samara had been telling her neighbors and friends about the park from the moment she thought of it, and it seemed as though everyone wanted to be a part of making her vision a reality. As soon as her idea was approved, Samara called a meeting for anyone interested in collaborating. At the meeting, residents voted on what would be included on the land: a playset for young children and one for older children, a swing set, several park benches, and a dog run. It was also decided that there would be a cooperative organic vegetable garden and an herb garden at the north end of the park. Residents agreed that Mrs. Yang would manage the gardens. At Wanda's suggestion, Samara asked a representative from a nearby horticulture society to come and advise the group on the design of the park, the best native shrubs to plant and where to put them. Samara also asked local businesses to sponsor the park by the square foot so that the community would be able to afford equipment and plants. Surprised by the response, Samara went to the bank to open an account where the surplus would be saved for next spring. In a few weeks' time, the space had been cleared and residents were beginning to roll out sod and plant small vegetable plants and summer flowers. By midsummer, the community was able to enjoy the new peaceful space. Samara was happy to have been part of creating not only a beautiful space, but a common area where residents could come together. Question 1. Which detail supports the idea that Samara lives in a supportive community? A. Samara receives positive responses to participate in developing the park. B. Samara realizes the Pine Grove does not have an open public spaces. C. Samara spent many afternoons at the library. Question 2. Based on the details in the story, what conclusions can be drawn about the central idea of the story? A. Samara identified a need in her community and worked hard to fulfill that need. B. Librarians were an underappreciated resource in Samara's town before the zoning board meeting. Or C. Residents wanted to improve the town, so they sponsored a park. Question 3. How would the passage most likely be different if it were narrated from Samara's first-person point of view? A. The portrayal of Wanda would be less detailed, but since Samara can only experience Wanda's character from the outside. B. The narrative would omit the scene that shows the zoning board meeting. Or C. The reader would have a more direct experience of Samara's thoughts and feelings. Question 4. Select the word in paragraph 8 that means an amount left over or an excess. A. Surplus. B. Response. C. Community. What is the resolution of this story? Question 5. What is the resolution of this story? Wanda helps Samara come up with a plan to present to the town zoning board. A. B. Samara gives a presentation to the town zoning board about creating a new park. C. Samara and the members of her community come together and create a new park. Question 6. In a story about a park, why was it important for the author to describe Samara's visits to the library? A. Without research, Samara might not have known how to go about creating the park. B. The author wished to show that Samara had a full, diverse life in addition to her park activism. C. Wanda, the librarian, was the originator of the idea to create the park. Question 7. Which conclusion can be drawn from the last paragraph of this story? Samara's family proudly joins the park staff. B. Samara will run a workshop for less experienced gardeners. C. Samara feels a sense of accomplishment. Read the passage. Excerpts from The Final Assault from High Adventure by Edmund Hillary. At 6:30 a.m. we crawled slowly out of the tent and stood on our little ledge. Already the upper part of the mountain was bathed in sunlight. It looked warm and inviting, but our ledge was dark and cold. We lifted our oxygen onto our backs and slowly connected up the tubes to our face masks. My 30-pound load seemed to crush me downward and stifled all enthusiasm, but when I turned on the oxygen and breathed it deeply, the burden seemed to lighten and the old urge to get to grips with the mountain came back. We strapped on our crampons and tied on our nylon rope, grasped our ice axes, and were ready to go. What do you think of it, Tenzing? And the immediate response, very bad, very dangerous. Do you think we should go on? And there came the familiar reply that never helped you much, but never let you down. Just as you wish. I waved him on to take a turn at leading. Changing the lead much more frequently now, we made our unhappy way upward, sometimes sliding back and wiping out half a dozen steps and never feeling confident that at any moment the whole slope might not avalanche. In the hope of some sort of belay, we traversed a little towards the rocks, but I found no help in their smooth, holdless surface. We plunged on, then upward. And then I noticed that a little above us, the left-hand rock ridge turned into snow, and the snow looked firm and safe. Laboriously and carefully, we climbed across some steep rock, and I sank my ice axe shaft into the snow of the ridge. It went firm and hard. The pleasure of this safe belay, after all the uncertainty below, was like a reprieve to a condemned man. Strength flowed into my limbs, and I could feel my tense nerves and muscles relaxing. I swung my ice axe at the slope and started chipping a line of steps upward. It was very steep, but seemed so gloriously safe. Tenzing, an inexpert but enthusiastic step cutter, took a turn and chopped a haphazard line of steps up another pitch. We were making fast time now, and the slope was starting to ease off. Tenzing gallantly waved me through, and with a growing feeling of excitement, I cramponed up some firm slopes to the rounded top of the south summit. It was only 9 a.m. It was 11:30 a.m. My first sensation was one of relief that the long grind was over, that the summit had been reached before our oxygen supplies had dropped to a critical level, and relief that in the end the mountain had been kind to us in having a pleasantly rounded cone for its summit instead of a fearsome and unapproachable cornice. But mixed with the relief was a vague sense of astonishment that I could have been the lucky one to attain the ambition of so many brave and determined climbers. It seemed difficult at first to grasp that we'd got there. I was too tired and too conscious of the long way down to safety really to feel any great elation. But as the fact of our success thrust itself more clearly into my mind, I felt a quiet glow of satisfaction spread through my body, a satisfaction less vociferous but more powerful than I had ever felt on a mountaintop before. I turned and looked at Tenzing. Even beneath his oxygen mask and the icicles hanging from his hair, I could see his infectious grin of sheer delight. Question 8. Read these sentences from the final assault. This little slope was to be our campsite. It was certainly far from flat, and it was to need a lot of work on it before we could possibly pitch a tent. We carefully moved all the gear to one side and then set to work with our ice axes to remove the surface snow off a reasonably large area. 10 inches down we struck rock, and after an hour's work we had cleared an area about 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. The slope underneath was made up of stones and rubble all firmly glued together with ice. This was much harder going. With the picks on our ice axes, we chopped away at the slope, prizing out the separate stones and scraping away the rubble. Which phrase best explains why the idea in this sentence and in these sentences were organized as they are? A. To demonstrate why their actions are important. B. To explain how to pitch a tent on a mountain. C. To describe the difficulties of creating a camp. Question 9. Read these sentences from the final assault. Still a little worried about my boots, I asked Tenzing to lead off, always willing to do his share and more than his share if necessary. Tenzing scrambled past me and tackled the slope. In this short excerpt, the narrator gives an example of how important it is for climbers to help each other. How does the narrator develop this concept in the rest of the narrative? A. By showing a situation where one climber successfully assists another. B. By showing how climbers traverse difficult passages. C. By describing risky situations climbers encounter. Question 10. What effect does the point of view have on this narrative? A. It invites readers to experience making life or death situations. B. It lets readers witness Hillary's respect for Tenzing's opinion. C. It gives readers an intimate experience of the extremes of Mount Everest attempt. Read the passage. My first day on the job. I was in full panic mode. Here I was on my first day as an inexperienced reporter having to cover an important story with little guidance. I was starting to regret my decision to take the job. What was I doing here? I wasn't a journalism major. I didn't have a beat. I didn't even know all the rules about dealing with sources and off-the-record information. The previous spring, I'd taken up my boss on his offer and stayed at my part-time job through the summer after college. He gave me more hours, so I was making more money, but I didn't have the responsibility of a real job. I'd been an English major and wanted to be a writer, though I had no idea what kind of writer. I'd taken the summer to think about things and prepare for a fall job search. By the time I began the search for my first full-time job, the job market was in bad shape. During my first few months looking for a job, I sent out countless resumes and only had one interview. Unfortunately, I was very unqualified for the job at the time. Then a woman I worked with at my part-time job told me about a reporter position opening up at the newspaper chain where her daughter worked. Though I never thought about being a reporter, I figured it couldn't hurt to go on the interview. In addition to interview experience, the opportunity meant I was officially networking. All the job search materials I'd read stressed the importance of networking in finding a job. A few days later, I was sitting down with John, one of the executive editors of the newspaper chain, hearing all the daunting details of being a cub reporter. Although it sounded intimidating, it was also exciting, and John didn't seem deterred by the fact that I had no solid experience. He was happy with the few writing samples I'd brought to the interview and offered me the job on the spot. I thought about the opportunity over the weekend, and on Monday, I let John know I would take the job. There would be a learning curve, but I would also get to write every single day. 2 weeks later, when I arrived for my first day on the job, I discovered that my editor had been called away for a family emergency. I also learned that the state education department had announced that aid typically allocated to school districts in the area would not come through that year. This would be a blow to schools that had relied on funding to keep art, music, and sports programs running. Since Monday was press day, I needed to do all my reporting and have the story written by the end of the day. John told me that the fastest way to get reactions and comments from everyone involved was to go to the schools and talk directly to the principals, teachers, and parents. No one would be in their offices today. I jotted down the list of people that I should speak to and set out to cover my first story. On my way to the first school, my mind raced. I wasn't completely sure what I was supposed to be asking besides how the budget cuts would affect each school. As I tried to think of the kind of information that families in the community would want to know, I realized the answer was simple Reporter 101. Who, what, where, when, why, how. If I went back to the office with answers to all these questions, I would be able to write a complete article. I made the rounds hitting elementary, middle, and high schools. As I spoke to the people who ran these schools, I learned so much about what goes into keeping a school's doors open and all the work that goes into offering students a solid education. It made me think that my new job as a reporter was going to be easy in comparison. By the time I finished up, I'd gotten a crash course in interviewing and had received an interesting range of opinions about the budget cuts. I was already thinking about how I would open the story when I got back to the office. My last step before writing was to get comments from the governor's office and do some research on past years when the state aid was in jeopardy. The next day, I saw my very first news story in print. My editor was happy with it when he returned, and over the next few months, I learned a great deal from him about how to cover a story well, how to handle my sources, and how to make a boring story seem interesting. Fortunately, after fine-tuning the state budget, the governor's office was able to reinstate the aid money for area school districts. And thanks to my first story, I'd already met most of the school administrators in person and had the beginnings of an actual list of sources for future stories. Question 11. Select the sentence from the excerpt that most effectively develops the idea that the narrator is a competent writer. A. He was happy with the few writing samples I'd brought to the interview and offered me the job on the spot. B. There would be a learning curve, but I would also get to write every single day. C. A few days later, I was sitting down with John, one of the executive editors of the newspaper chain, hearing all of the daunting details of being a cub reporter. Question 12. Which choice states the central idea of this passage? A. To be a good reporter requires more than just good writing skills. B. Communities should be more willing to support education. C. The news is gathered by many professionals working together. Question 13. How does the point of view shape what the reader learns from the narrative? A. It gives the reader an account of how a reporter researches for a story. B. It tells the reader how the narrator conquers her fears on her first day as a reporter. C. It shows the reader the challenges of working as a cub reporter on a busy newspaper. Question 14. How does the author feel about the opportunity to be a reporter? A. The prospect is challenging and unfamiliar, but it's exciting. B. The author worries she will jeopardize everything she has worked for. C. It is an unsatisfying prospect since it's not the job that she wanted. Read the passage. Lifetime service. When my grandfather returned from World War II, he married my grandmother and they settled in a new suburban town in the Northeast. Shortly after buying a home, he opened a hardware store. The homes in the town, most of which were being sold to returning soldiers, were uniform, and everyone wanted to add his or her own personal touch. Homeowners went to the hardware store for everything they needed and quickly realized it was the place for how-to advice on do-it-yourself projects. Over the years, my grandfather typically employed people from town because he wanted to keep his community strong. He lived what he considered a normal, quiet life, so he was surprised when he was approached by a town council member one day while running an errand. My grandfather was told that the town wanted to honor him for his community service. He would receive an award after the Memorial Day parade. My grandfather, who was not one to look for attention, thanked the council members and refused, asked to reconsider before saying no. My grandfather agreed to think about it. Returning home that day, my grandfather went to the garage to finish a project. He'd forgotten all about the offer of an award. Little did he know that the news had already been set in motion. My grandmother heard about the award later that day from a neighbor who let my mother, and my aunt know within hours. That night, a few of us went to my grandparents' house to talk about the award. We convinced my grandfather that it would be fun for all of us to go to the parade and see him receive the award. We were sure it would be a quick ceremony, and he would probably just pose for a few pictures with the mayor and the council members. We were all surprised when we learned the extent of the town's plans. On Memorial Day, we saw that a stage and seating had been set up in the town square. There was an entire front row of seating reserved for our family, and above the stage, my grandfather's name was emblazoned on a large banner that read Lifetime Service Award. My grandfather had also been invited to be in the parade as a passenger in a 1944 pickup truck, much like the one he owned when he moved to town. After the parade, the mayor and several other town officials gave speeches about how my grandfather dedicated his life to the community. Then some of his friends got up to share a few words. Stories were shared about my grandfather helping construct additions to neighbors' homes, dredging the town lake in the 1960s so that kids could actually swim in it, offering sage advice to other entrepreneurs who wanted to start businesses in town, and offering service as a volunteer firefighter for years. My siblings and cousins and I thought we knew everything about our grandfather, but that day we learned how highly he was thought of by other people. As the ceremony closed, the mayor announced that my grandfather's portrait would be hung in Town Hall. We had a good laugh about that since my grandfather always maintained that any picture taken of him looked like a mugshot. We stayed at the town square for hours after the ceremony ended that Memorial Day. My grandfather talked to his neighbors, and we heard more news stories from people who had known him for decades. I heard about how he caught a squirrel in Miss Gennaro's attic in 1974, and about how he rebuilt the engine of the Flynn's truck when Mr. Flynn thought he was going to have to sell it to the junkyard and buy a new one. I also learned that there were some things my grandfather couldn't do. He had attempted to coach a junior football team one year, and the team lost every single game. The most important thing I learned that day, though, was that one person who can have a big impact on others, even without realizing it. Question 15. Read the sentence from paragraph 1 in A Lifetime of Service. The homes in the town, most of which were being sold to returning soldiers, were uniform, and everyone wanted to add his or her own personal touch. Pick the phrase that means uniform to complete the sentence. The homes in the town were A, being built, B, in rows, C, nearly identical. Question 16. Which excerpts from the narrative most clearly show the reason why the author wrote it? A, returning home that day, my grandfather went to the garage to finish a project. He'd forgotten all about the offer of an award. B, we convinced my grandfather that it would be fun for all of us to go to the parade and see him receive the award. C, the most important thing I learned that day, though, was that one person can have a big impact on others even without realizing it. Question 17. What outcomes do the events in the narrative have for the narrator? A, she decides to make changes in her life. B, she understands why her grandfather did not want the award. C, she learns new facts about her grandfather's life history. Question 18. I would like 9 completion points for taking this test. A, yes. B, no.